I think that we're going to discover that we're applying LLMs and generative AI to too many problems. And my guess is somewhere around like 5% of the problems we're applying to, it's actually capable of solving well. And the other 95% are going to be a sinkhole of wasted resources, opportunity, time, money. I'm deeply concerned about the state of information technology in general in the world when it comes to news, media, social media, and the surveillance economy that we have now. I don't think it makes sense to apply data science to venture investing.
Hello everyone and welcome to Fintech Leaders, coming to you from New York City. I'm your host, Miguel Armaza. I'm a co-founder of Differential Ventures, a venture capital fund that backs early stage fintech entrepreneurs in the US, Canada, and Latin America. If you enjoyed this conversation, I invite you to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows so more people can learn about fintech leaders. Today, I sit down with David Magerman, managing partner and co-founder at Differential Ventures, an early-stage fund that invests on data-focused entrepreneurs building enterprise technology. In a past life, he spent 22 years in many leadership roles at Renaissance Technologies, or RenTech, a hedge fund with over $100 billion in AUM, and probably the most successful fund in history. David is also a contrarian thinker and a non-conformist, which made our conversation even more interesting. In this episode, we discuss how David and a small group of engineers helped introduce quantitative data science to trading and public capital markets investing, why he is highly skeptical of the new wave of generative AI, especially when it comes to fintech, a very convincing argument to introduce friction in online communication processes to restore balance and reduce its negative effects on society, and a lot more. David, welcome to Fintech Leaders. Thank you for joining me all the way from, is it Philadelphia?
Philadelphia, yes.
Great. So, David, for the audience, let's hear a couple of minutes about your background. You do have a pretty interesting background, how you got into venture capital. You're not a career VC.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so maybe guide us through that interesting journey.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Thank you for having me here. Looking forward to connecting with your audience. So I actually come from the computer science field. I was a technologist starting at a very young age. You know, I'm old enough to have seen the birth of home computers. My TRS-80, my Radio Shack computer, Tandy Radio Shack, very early days, 4 kilobytes of RAM, if you can believe that. And, wrote software as a kid and eventually went to college and got an undergraduate degree in computer science. And I was really there for the birth of data-driven approaches to solving natural language understanding problems. This is back in the, it was no longer the beginning days of speech recognition. That was already using data science and machine learning. But textual analysis, understanding language from a semantic perspective and from a grammatical perspective was still in its infancy. And I was a part of a team at IBM that I did my PhD thesis from Stanford, but I did the work at IBM and did early work on trying to apply the machine learning data analysis technologies that were built for speech recognition, applying it to language in general. And then, seeing that was still probably a decade or two away, a bunch of us from the team left and went into quantitative trading, where as opposed to in language, where back in the 1990s, there was a dearth of data. In that same era, going into the early 2000s, there was an enormous amount of data for doing analysis of the financial markets. And so a bunch of us nerds from IBM went to join this quantitative hedge fund, Renaissance Technologies, and we started applying data science to understanding how to predict the financial markets and trade in them. And that was where I learned how to transition from using theoretical research techniques, which frankly can be as flawed as they are. It doesn't really matter. You just want to publish a paper. And then when you start deploying them in the world, you see that if you actually make mistakes in research, they can cost you money. And that was kind of a novelty to me, the idea that we actually had to be rigorous in how we did our research in order to not lose a lot of money with deploying it. And I think that was something that, given the early stages of data science and AI, even in speech recognition, it wasn't clear there was rigor in how the science was being done, which led to some bad outcomes. And so then I was at Renaissance in a variety of roles as a manager and as a researcher, when I was in charge of production, the trading operations for a while. And then eventually I left in about 2017, looking to move on to a different phase of my career. And really, I wanted to go back to my engineering roots, kind of reconnect with engineers who are going back to my IBM days, who are actually realizing the potential of 20 years of research that I'd seen happen, and were deploying it in the world. And I, as someone who had been deploying data science in a very real way, trading, billions of dollars in portfolios that were managed using data science, I understood a lot about what can go wrong with AI. And I wanted to try to inform, startup founders and early users of this technology on how to not make the mistakes we made so that they wouldn't have their customers suffer consequences from bad instantiations of this. And I found that there was really not a lot of people in the venture investing community that had the kind of experience I had in the real world successfully deploying AI. There were a lot of people who've unsuccessfully deployed it, made a lot of money off of their unsuccessful deployments, but, frankly, didn't really get a lot of, value out of what they produced. And I saw it as an opportunity to add a dimension of information to the investing process that could help create better startups. And so I joined my partner, Nick Adams, at Differential Ventures back at the beginnings of the company. And we've been investing together for a little over 5 years in data-focused startups, anywhere from applied AI to deep research, deep technology, inventing new ways of doing AI, ML ops companies, infrastructure tools, and just general data analytics companies, including cybersecurity and a few other odds and ends along the way. But we found an enormous opportunity in that field. It's now a pretty crowded space, but we're trying to stay ahead of the curve and continue to find the next opportunities that people aren't focused on to try to broaden the application of these technologies in the world.
A lot to unpack across your career. IBM is still a big company, probably not even close to what it was 25 years ago in many respects. What was so special about IBM back when you were there?
So I'll tell you what was special and also what was flawed. What was special was that it had the resources to hire amazing scientists who could do basic research. It was kind of the tail end of that opportunity. I think that the opportunity for there to be these kind of conglomerate basic research companies that don't really have to make money off of the research is not really a reality so much anymore. But at the time, there were just teams that were like inventing things and trying things out, very exploratory. The downside of that, which was very frustrating to our teams, the teams we worked in, is that they weren't really that focused on bridging from the research to the products. And in fact, I remember the day when we found out that the speech recognition group, which had been doing enormous amount of work trying to build a product for speech recognition to deploy in the world, we found out that IBM had contracted with one of our biggest competitors, Dragon Systems, to kind of white label their product instead of using the in-house research tool. And we were just kind of devastated that IBM's product was going to have none of the research we'd produced over the last, 10, 15 years. So I think that, there's an upside to that kind of research team, research lab kind of environment, but I think it facilitates being disconnected from the product world. And we didn't really build deep connections to translate. It's almost like, in universities, they have these technology transfer centers where they try to translate technology from research to the real world. Surprisingly enough, IBM did a very poor job of that, even though it was actually a company. So I'm sure it's very different today. This is very dated, not to cast aspersions on IBM, but I think it's also informed the way that I look at very large companies and their innovation wings, in that I think that there is a tension between doing great innovative work and building products. And I feel like even though like Google or Microsoft could build any of the solutions that we end up investing at the early stage from small startups, the truth is that the startup founders are probably better positioned to and better qualified. Any great scientists at Google are probably working on their core product. They're not working on some fringe research project that may or may not yield some fruit. So I think the startup founders that come out of those companies are far more likely with less resources to be successful than people inside those companies.
Yeah, it's that old question that, for good reason, founders absolutely hate is, what if Google builds this, right? So it sounds like you were doing cutting edge research, but it was being shelved.
Well, the area I was working in was worth being shelved because it really didn't work. It's more like the people doing like the frontline speech recognition, what they were doing also frankly didn't work. The problem with IBM's system was that it was so effective and so powerful that it wouldn't fit on even a very large desktop. And, the models were too big. There were too many parameters. They were too large, and they also required too much computing resources. And you look at something like what Dragon Systems was producing, it was much smaller, much more lightweight. And IBM management at the time was pushing the team to make it smaller, to make it faster. And there was that, size, speed, performance trade-off where the accuracy would go down, and the kind of elitist, perfectionists of IBM didn't want to sacrifice precision. But then that's in the end, I think, why they lost to some of the less accurate startups, because they were willing just to throw a product out there, whether it worked or not. And I think we eventually converged on the intersection of both performance and speed and size, but it didn't end up being IBM's products that did that.
So you mentioned you and a small team of IBMers moving to Renaissance Technology or RenTech and being amongst the first to apply data science to capital markets analysis. I'm curious, at that time, did you have the computer power to execute all that you wanted to do? Where maybe tell us, because this is the very, very beginning.
As you can imagine, as is well known, Renaissance is pretty secretive, so I can't talk much about the inner workings of what was there. And in fact, we weren't the first, and we weren't the only participant in the field. We tended to be we were the most consistent and, the most persistent. We survived, when a lot of other companies failed. And I think that was, as much as there were brilliant people, and there are brilliant people at a place like Renaissance, I think a big part of it was the engineering that we brought. That when I got there in 1995, and there was a period of 4 or 5 years where gradually a few IBMers came over. It wasn't like in one shot. And if a guy had already left IBM before I got to Renaissance, they didn't have computer scientists there. They had, really brilliant people, but they didn't have a strong computer science focused part of their team. And so I think what IBM brought in was engineering, I dare say genius, not myself, but, everyone else that came along, that there was a dearth of engineering ability, of really core computer science analysis of the problem. And when you're writing systems, you can write them in a straightforward way and get a certain outcome. But if you understand how to design software systems with object-oriented programming and with proper factoring of code, it makes it much more sustainable, much more testable, and much more flexible in how it can do its job. And I think that really in the first few years we were at IBM, the IBMers came to Renaissance, it really was more just about giving some computer science discipline to the process. The same researchers were there before and after that, but I think the researchers that were there became much more performant and much more effective in applying what they knew to doing the work they did, because we built better software systems.
In public capital markets, you get immediate feedback, right? You had a good trading day, when the markets close. You have a bad one, you also know that, and your LPs know that. Venture capital is very different. How, tell us about this transition. How did you adapt to this very different pace?
So I haven't yet, but I'm coping. But I think that it's what you said is really an important point to make, which is to understand why I don't think it makes sense to apply data science to venture investing. I think that the same way in which there isn't the immediate feedback, I don't think it's possible to know. The way that you know that a system works in quantitative trading is that, aside from all the testing, the rigorous testing you do, is that if you put in a system, and it starts losing money, maybe it's not working. And you also have expectations of how it's supposed to work. So you can compare what your expectations are to what's actually happening. In venture capital on the time scale where you're talking about like time scales of like 3 to 10 years of an investment horizon where mark-to-market valuations don't really mean anything. An up round because you raised a follow-on capital, we mark those up in our portfolios for sure and tell our investors and pat ourselves on the back, but they don't really mean anything unless there's an exit opportunity. And so we really are looking for that long-term trajectory of how are we going to monetize this down the road. So anything that you do that uses quantitative inputs when it comes to long time scale investing has to really be supporting your intuition and just accelerating and enhancing the efficiency of how you do things. It can't really be doing the job for you. And I've seen a number of proposals out there of funds claiming to be structured around, automated analysis, using data science to automatically recommend investments. That works in a short-term time scale because the law of large numbers helps you prove out whether something works or not. In venture, and even relatively, shorter time scale, but relatively long time scale equity public markets investments, you really need tens to hundreds to thousands of years of data to really bear out whether something works. So, you could use it, but you can't use it in the same kind of unsupervised way that you can do it when the law of large numbers works for you. You have to really have a human oversight. And so if it's an efficiency tool, like we use algorithms and data to make our human analysis more efficient, but I don't see any place where I could use it to replace my analysis or take the work of 15 or 20 people and have an algorithm do it and then just use the output. I just don't, you could do it. I just have no idea whether it works or not. And I would never know. It would just be like a black box that I have to, cross my fingers and hope it worked.
You mentioned about 5 years ago joining Differential, and part of your goal was to apply that past life experience specifically in cutting edge of AI data science. Now, obviously, the past couple of years, everyone is talking about it. And you have some strong opinions about this new wave of Gen AI. I'd love for you to expand on that.
Sure. I've been working with language models literally since my childhood, but for over 30 years. So I've seen the evolution of complexity of these models and also seen the massive growth of data. The mathematics behind them haven't changed that much. In fact, the mathematics behind, the underlying features of large language models, these neural networks, is actually somewhat primitive. It's got a lot of window dressing on top of it. Smart people have built on top of it, but we rejected neural nets back in the 80s because they just didn't work because there wasn't enough data. And at some point, you built models which were really capturing self-organizing structure and discovering structure in data, which was really innovative and powerful. I think that what large language models have done is jump to the other side of the equation. They've now memorized all their data. I've seen large language models which have 10 to 100 times as many parameters as data points, which doesn't make any sense to me as a data scientist because you're supposed to be capturing, patterns, not, multiplying and growing, the data. And so what I think is going on with these very large language models, which are still somewhat of a black box to most people, they're, OpenAI, famously called OpenAI, it's pretty much closed AI. They don't really tell you much what they're doing. But I think what they're doing, what they're accomplishing is memorizing their data in multiple instances. So it's taking a piece of data that's in the context, in a, concentric circles of context, and it's finding which parts of the context it's in as it grows out are relevant to a different interpretation of that data point, and then storing in its neural network, a parameters that represent that incarnation or that instantiation of that piece of data. And then, you can grow that wildly large, which I think we've got these very large language models which have done that. You can also be more efficient and prune that to be what are the most valuable instantiations of patterns. But when you prune them down to more manageable size, you lose the memory aspect of it. And I think some of the appearances of AGI that we've seen, that it looks like these things are like just artificial general intelligence. I think that's coming from the fact that we're basically giving these tools access to 30 years of human digital output and giving it the ability to memorize so much of it that, if you could spend like a year mining the internet for an answer to a single question, you would probably come up with if you're restricted just to sequences of words or semantic variants of things that were in the internet, you could probably come up with a pretty intelligent answer. I think that's to a degree what these large language models are doing, which is a useful tool for that problem. But it's not a useful tool for some of these more, they're trying to like solve math problems with it. And, the reason why certain sciences I think it does well on, they say that it passes, chemistry AP tests, it passes, the bar exam. I think that's because of all of the resources on the internet, which are actually geared towards helping you prepare for these things. So the information is out there and you can use it. But I don't think that, memorization and semantic variation are really useful skills, but they're not, the sum total of general intelligence. And I think that we're going to discover that we're applying LLMs and generative AI to too many problems. And my guess is somewhere around like 5% of the problems we're applying to, it's actually capable of solving well. And the other 95% are going to be a sinkhole of wasted resources, opportunity, time, money. And the hope is that customers will not be so frustrated by that 95% of loss that they'll throw away the 5% of value. And I think it's incumbent on startup founders to recognize this risk. And even if they're in that 5%, they've got to prepare for the bad news that when some major AI product line fails in a very public way, that they're going to suffer a loss of revenue, churn, loss of interest from customers, just because, more naive customers who don't understand the difference between what they're doing and what the rest of the world's doing might abandon AI prematurely. And it's just something that founders need to understand. First of all, know which bucket you're in. If you're in a bucket where there's never been a successfully deployed product comparable to what you're trying to do, don't know that you can do it, because you might not be able to. And I look at companies like that as an investor, and I'm looking for not just paid pilots or POCs. I want to see 6 months to a year of deployed product, which right now doesn't exist. So I'm really reluctant to invest in Gen AI, very modern Gen AI. I'll miss out on some unicorns, but I think it's the right value proposition. But when it comes to deployed AI, if I see a company that's got something in the market, we have a couple in our portfolio where customers have been using it for a year, 2 years. They might have added some more, uses of LLMs to their core technology because they're available. But even without the LLMs, I know the product works. And so the LLMs can only make it better. I think those are the kinds of things that I want to invest in and that I encourage founders to be pursuing as their business lines.
So you're afraid that some founders, whether they know it or not, might be building sort of like a house of cards.
Oh, I've seen it. Yeah, they are. And I think it's because of the advertising prowess of the OpenAIs and Microsofts of the world. They've made it seem like, and some of them have been caught like canning demos and faking performance. Anytime you see a snapshot on social media of an interaction with GPT-4, I want to know, is that doctored? I want to know, is that just typed in? Is that, it doesn't have to be real. I mean, marketing is marketing, and people want to, they want to make money. They don't necessarily care about integrity sometimes. And founders can be sucked in to believing that the demos that they see and the videos they see online are actually accurate representations of the capabilities of these APIs. And they take that as a given that the API works, and then they build a brilliant product on top of it. But if the API is less performant than advertised or doesn't work at all, then yeah, that's the kind of definition of house of cards.
Other than kind of historical proof in time, how else are you kind of assessing whether this is real or not when you meet a new entrepreneur that is raising a round?
Right. So the first question I ask anyone doing generative AI is, what would your product look like 4 years ago? Meaning before LLMs existed and were in the industry. We're in at least the research phase before OpenAI launched, but not for long. And so the question is, if these LLMs didn't exist, there was a whole, evolution of AI before them. Transformer models were transformational, pardon the pun, but AI still did a lot of things. The question is, would you have a solution pre-LLM? And if they haven't thought about it, or they don't have an answer, then that's usually the end of the conversation. If they, a lot of times they'll wave their hands, but eventually come around to something. But most of the good companies, the ones that really have a substantial product that will work, know that the LLMs are just an incremental enhancement on top of what they were doing already. They could do something without them. It just might not work as well. But frankly, it might work as well. They just don't have to bother because LLMs are out there. I think that to me is the litmus test that I use to figure out if there's something early stage that's worth looking at more closely and maybe investing in.
And how about some of the examples where it is working? Maybe we can zoom in on fintech, any part of fintech, be it capital markets, be it lending. What are some of the areas, some of the use cases where you've been wowed?
Well, I think that, summarization, things that people do slowly that don't require, where the extent to which deeper human intelligence adds value but isn't necessary, those are things that I think that already LLMs can do really well. We actually just onboarded, a meeting summarizer, one of these Zoom integration tools that will give us summaries of meetings. I don't rely on them exclusively. I make my own summaries also, but they're actually pretty good at capturing the substance of what was said, transcribing it well, and then putting it into bullet points that do a better job. It's better mnemonic for me to remember what the meeting was. If I wasn't there, I wouldn't trust it because it does get things wrong, but it's a great way for me. If I forgot to take notes and 2 days later, someone asked me what happened in this meeting, if I go back to the AI generated notes, I will remember crystal clear what happened. And frankly, they also record them and give me transcripts. And so I really could find out what happened. But I think that, and again, I think that piece is critical. If it was just an AI summarizer, I would not be happy. But because it links back to the source transcription and then links back to the source audio, to me, that closes the loop on the power of the tool. I think a lot of people are looking at those connections to the reality, throwing them away and relying on just the derived product, which still has flaws. There's still hallucinations. There are still transcription errors. And in any case, it's not intelligent. So it doesn't really know what any of the words mean. It only is using its, 30 years of human digital product of context to put everything you say in a context which hopefully accurately buckets it into what's been said before. But it's not intelligent. And so it will make mistakes that you won't be able to recover from if you throw away the source data.
So that's AI. Are there other parts within, I guess, the tech world, other products, technologies that you are particularly concerned about, that you are paying attention to, be it from your point of view as a VC or in general?
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned about the state of information technology in general in the world when it comes to news, media, social media, and the surveillance economy that we have now. We were recently pitched a company that discovered that every car made in the world now stores your location data, and they can buy that data and then resell it and, track with quote unquote anonymization, which doesn't really work. And, if there's a location data point that starts at my personal home and then drives to my children's school and then drives to a gym and then drives to a doctor's office, you can figure out it's me. So these kinds of things are really dangerous out in the wild. But I think that if you think about like 40, maybe you're too young, but like going back 40 years ago and longer, we had 3 television networks. We had, maybe 2 to 4 newspapers of record, depending on your perspective. And I would submit that we knew more about the world we had more information from an information theory perspective, more bits of information about the world then than we do now with, an exponential growth in, even this podcast is an example of yet another source of information. But what I find is that when I read the news, even with all the tools out there to aggregate, whether it's Apple News or these curated AI-powered news aggregators, if I actually make a mistake of reading an article, I will spend more time researching the sources of that article to verify to determine the veracity of it, understand the biases of the authors, figure out what they didn't say, that I will spend so much more time researching the article and then discover that probably half the things in the article weren't true. That if I just read news, I will know less truth and less information than if I just didn't bother. So I don't. And people always ask me, where do you get your news? And I say, I don't. I talk I'm very concerned about what's going on in Israel right now. And I have friends who are serving on the front lines. I have people whose children are serving. I know military leaders. I understand not everyone has access to this kind of information, but if not for that, I would say I just don't know what's going on in Israel. So I think that, but it's a tragedy because we pride ourselves in the world today of being the most informed, the most information-rich, era in humanity. And yet I think that we've gone so far backwards. I think it's made it harder to make decisions in the world. I think it's made it hard for the governments of the world to operate. I think we've seen with elections that elections are being determined by everything but, self-interest and what's good for countries long-term and short-term. And we've also found that there's an attention span problem that's developing, that people, because they're afraid of not getting this fake information that's not really information in a timely manner, people are even my hand is in the shape of my phone right now because my hand is so often holding my phone looking at, a news feed or something like that. And so I think that we've monetized our attention so much that everyone's making money off of making us have no attention span. We can't think clearly. I have the only notifications I have on my phone are from my family. Everything else is just silent. And it's so painful when I go to a meeting and you have people around the table and most of their time is spent responding to either beeps or vibrations or checking things. How can you concentrate on complex problems if you can't spend more than 30 seconds actually listening to a discussion of them? So I think I've said a lot. It's a very multifaceted and complex problem, but I think it's actually the problem of our day. It's kind of like, the intellectual COVID. The world stopped because of COVID and we had to deal with it because it was a physical disease. We're not addressing the impact of information technology, whereas I think it's having far more impact on more people than COVID did. And we're just kind of letting it run its course to great detriment.
It sounds like a very complex problem to solve, and it requires common will. I suspect you also spend time thinking about the solution to this problem. Have you encountered any teams working on solutions or? Yeah,
no one that's really produced anything that I'd say is going to have an impact very soon. To me, the biggest problem, which is, I think, endemic to computer systems, is the lack of friction. That, when I was doing quantitative trading, the reason we had an advantage was because we reacted to market data at computer speed when everyone else had to actually read something at your brain speed. And eventually the world has moved to only computers trading with computers with, a certain amount of human input, depending on how automated versus how manual you want your process to be. But I think that introducing friction that will bring the reaction to human behavioral data, the reaction to human influencing experience, to bring it back to human speed is critical to restoring the balance. As an example, one thing I would love to see produced, although I haven't found the right people to implement this, is the idea of being paid for receiving email. So, and it goes to text messages and other kind of contact. It used to be that you wanted to get, people sent things in the mail and it cost, used to cost 2 cents, then it was 5 cents. Now I don't know if it's like 45 cents a dollar, whatever it is. But, a piece of mail going through there was friction. You had to like put something in an envelope, lick it, cut your tongue maybe, and then put it in the mail and pay some money to send something. So, and then there were bulk rate ways of sending things cheaper, but they still cost per. Now when you get spam, you get robocalls, you get spam texts, they're effectively free to the sender, but certainly not to me. So if I could have a system where if you send me any kind of message, the first time you send it to me, you'd have to pay me 1/100th of a cent. So we'll have an accounting system that manages this. Then you send me a second message before I've responded, and then you have to give me 1/10th of a cent. And then the third message is a penny. And then the fourth message is a dime. And then eventually it will become prohibitively expensive for you to keep pestering me with messages without me responding. If I respond, I pay you back the money you send me, and then we're all clean. But if we could have that friction in the system to prevent the, massive exponential scale, the computer scale interactions that your robocall computer is sending me something at computer speed with no friction, I, as a human being, am having my life interrupted and my attention span disrupted by having to process it. Even if I just ignore it, I still got interrupted. So I think that introducing friction at key points in the information communication process to break that link between computer speed on one side and human disruption on the other, I think that cost structure, if we could monetize that in a way which compensates people for their interruptions, I think that would recreate a balance that would be much more manageable. I don't know that it solves every problem. I think it would clear away so much of the problem that whatever was left would be much more obvious of what's wrong with it and why and how you need to fix it.
Yeah, I love that. I could see, so it's essentially a personal paywall, and you could have a software provider that integrates that across all your social network and email accounts. We'll see. Let me know if you find it.
I was told by one startup email founder that was very successful relative to, they're not Google, but they were successful, and they claimed that they thought of it, tried it out, piloted it, and didn't work. I suspect that what happened was that their commercial customers convinced them not to do it because it's very antagonistic to this kind of the way that advertising is done today, the way influencing is done today. And so I think that the rank and file humanity would benefit from it, but corporate America would be, and political corporate America would suffer for it.
David, before we run out of time, a couple questions. Are there traits across the entrepreneurs that you have backed that kind of reflect all these concerns that you're talking about of how they tune out the noise?
Look, I'm a human being that wants to have an impact in the world. I'm an advocate. I'm a philanthropist. I want to do good in the world. But I have a hat on where I'm looking to make money for my investors. And the truth is that the problems in society and industry and technology are where they are because of capitalism. Social media without monetizing human behavioral data would never make money. So if you were looking to invest in a social media company, if you did the right thing and only invested in ones that aren't monetizing your data, you go out of business before you got anywhere because it's profitable to do what people are doing. It's legal. Some people think it's ethical. I'm not one of them, but it's certainly legal. And so you can't compete with those actors because they're going to be far more profitable than you unless you join what they're doing. And so I think that what I try to do is avoid the problem altogether. So we don't invest in consumer products almost at all. We invest exclusively in B2B solutions that are really helping enterprises and in some cases SMBs solve problems in their workflows that are already being solved maybe poorly, and using technology, data, AI to solve those problems better. I don't think I could invest in a founder that was trying to do something good in the world with information technology because they would almost certainly go out of business. And that's just a sad reality. I invest in them on the philanthropic side. I've supported some nonprofits. The Center for Humane Technology is doing great work. There's a Tech Transparency Project, which is advocating for these things. But from a business perspective, investing my investors' money, in case any of my investors are listening to this podcast, I'm trying to make money. I'm trying to make a profit. And I want to do it in a way where I can sleep at night and know that I'm doing good in the world. But I can't invest in people that are tilting at windmills, going to lose their shirts just to try to prove a philosophical point.
So, David, we're doing this interview over Riverside, so we're doing it remotely. I can see behind you have a very nice, beautiful office, and I can see a lot of books. Are there any favorite books that you like to either often go back to, you like recommending people? Any books that you would like to share with the audience?
I mean, I'm a religious person myself, Torah observant Jew, and while that's not for everybody, and obviously, not everyone's Jewish, but I do think that the Torah and some of the commentaries are particularly powerful. Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed away a few years ago, I got to know him very well. He's written a number of books that are about the world today, about communication, about social media, about leadership. And I think his writings, anything he had written in the last, let's say, 5 to 7 years, really is very relevant. It uses Torah as a prism to look through, but it's really understanding the world today in a way which humanizes the problems and tries to present human solutions. So I'm a big fan of his work. I also like to read classic science fiction. I'm a big fan of Asimov. I mean, Tolkien is not really science fiction, but he did have a lot to say about the intersection between what we use magic, which I would call technology, a bit of magic. But a lot of the classic science fiction writers saw the future. I mean, even going back to some of the politically oriented ones like Orwell, they could extrapolate, seeing in the 1950s, they saw computers, they could extrapolate what they might be able to do. And they've painted pictures of today in a very negative light, in a very accurate light. And I think I went back and reread 1984. I went back and reread some of those, kind of classic pieces of literature that tried to detangle the politics of technology. I reread the Foundation series from Asimov, which talked a lot about this, about humanity evolving into a place where people never had physical contact anymore, that they were afraid of getting infected from each other, and they just lived in holographic bubbles of solitariness. And I think those they're available to us. Modern literature, I don't put a lot of value in that. I think there's so much richness in the writings of the last 60 to 100 years that looks at the way technology might impact the world. And you can see it was really very prescient in the pictures they painted. And they also were more clear-headed about what the solutions would be. And I think there's a value in going back and looking at those.
But glad to know that we actually met at an old school small group dinner.
That's right. We met in person. Amazing.
Yeah. How about modern science fiction writers? Do you think they might be writing about a possible future that might become reality?
Well, I don't know which writers I'm reading that aren't generative AI. I don't find there to be a lot of creativity in modern science fiction. I mean, part of it is the democratization of a publication that, no offense, but the fact that you could have a podcast is a part of the problem, that there are so many channels and it's really hard to find the ones that have a right to be there. And so when I look at, this is why I've gone back to, I'm actually reading Dostoevsky now. I'm reading like really old, even fiction, just because I don't put a lot of faith in things that are published today that they're worth my time. I'm sure there are a lot that are, but for every one there is probably 1,000 that aren't. And it's just too easy to publish things now. So I just don't know that I can rely on that my time is worth. If I can read a 14th century commentary on the Torah, that's why I better use of my time than reading a 2023 sci-fi publication.
Right. The paradox of choice, right? As many call it. Well, David, thanks for voting with your feet and joining the podcast, giving it a vote of confidence. So I'm glad that you joined. Super interesting discussion. I'm going to be thinking a lot about what we've discussed and, hope it's not the last discussion we have. The next one will be in person.
Oh, please, God. Be great. Really great. Appreciate you inviting me. Glad to have the audience. And I do appreciate that you do this. I think that it's great to get, voices out there. People have to choose what they listen to. but they wouldn't have the chance if people didn't produce the content. So happy to be here and looking forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, David. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this great episode with David Magerman from Differential Ventures. If you want more interviews, make sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. It helps and means a lot. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts about the show, just drop me a line on Twitter or LinkedIn. Signing off till next week, I'm your host, Miguel Armaza.